Hey everyone, CW Music Reviews here. I'm CWD and this is going to be a music review of the new Tobacco album, Sweatbox Dynasty. This is the latest full-length album of singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, producer, Tobacco. He is probably best known for not just his solo stuff as, Tobacco, but also for his membership in the rather organic, psychedelic rock type band, Moth Super Rainbow. A band whose work I have never listened to, and I'm not gonna pretend otherwise. But they are certainly influential within the indie community. They certainly have quite a bit of a big following for them. And that was definitely beneficial for when Tobacco did go solo, when he makes some pretty interesting electronic music. Admittedly, the only one other than this new one that I have listened to was Ultima Massage 2, if that's the right album title name. That thing was pretty interesting, nice and abrupt, and kind of abrasive and vulgar in a sense. But maybe it was a bit too much for me to process all at once, and to this day I've only listened to it maybe one or two times, and I haven't found myself eager to return to it as often as maybe I should. Especially with this new album, Sweatbox Dynasty, I'm definitely impressed with what he is doing with this record in particular. This album's about 12 tracks in length, about 29 minutes long. To get this out of the way, I really do wish this album was a little longer than it is. I feel like Tobacco might have been able to throw in maybe 2 or 3 more tracks in the similar instrumental vein he is working with, and maybe I would have been able to enjoy the album a little better. 29 minutes does make this really accessible, certainly. It definitely grows on you every time you put it on, since it is so short, but it is also incredibly immediate, catchy, for the lack of a better word, a nice set of psychedelic bangers from the nightclubs from hell. This thing's a trip. It is without a doubt a trip. And you can definitely tell it's going to be something of that nature when you get to the first track, the opening track, Human Om. I like this catchy synth arpeggio on this cut that really does bring my attention to what the track is doing. There's maybe some touch of sitar on this cut, or some kind of sampled sitar. It definitely adds quite a bit of layers. What I love is this revving sound that comes up on the hook, and it's just so upfront and abrasive that I just love the crap out of it. I do like how more synth is placed into this cut that adds a wall of harmonious synth to it. I think that's a nice touch. There's definitely quite a bit of interesting synth patterns and synth usage on this record. The track Gods and Heat has this bass synth syncopation that really builds well into a semi-explosive chorus that I enjoy a lot. And one thing I do have to say about this track, and a good chunk of the tracks here, it's using traditional song structure. It's got a kind of a verse, a chorus, and a verse, even if the vocals aren't so clear and upfront, seeing as it's all vocoder, and I definitely enjoy the good chunk of vocoder that's on many of these tracks. Like on the track Warlock Mary, where this vocoder itself adds a whole layer of the wall of sound that a good chunk of these tracks seem to exhibit. The track also has these bright synths juxtaposed by these dark, bassy types of percussion going on. There's just so much that Tobacco has been able to pack into one single track, one single 1 or 2 minute cut, that really leaves me intrigued with what Tobacco could potentially do a little down the road. Like on the track Wipeth Out, which has this nasty ass bass synth that really overtakes everything, but not so much that it sounds like compressed or it's just burying everything else, but it's just so brief and hellish that I just can't help but get down to it. The track Hong, which has these gorgeous keys, there's a really catchy beat pattern and synth arpeggios to it. I think my one reservation for this track is not just because it's just a brief track, but maybe this is where he sounds his most Flying Lotus-ish on this cut. The way there's like these triplet synth patterns that are on the tail end of some of the passages on this track. Tobacco is certainly not without his influences, and he definitely implements them particularly well. Like on the track The Madonna, which sounds like if Tim Hecker made club bangers. Bass sounds incredibly staticky. I do love how harmonized and haphazard the synths are on this cut, especially when they just come in and out and in and out, like what would remind me of Tim Hecker's most recent album that I reviewed quite positively. There's even some guitar worked into this album, like the track Dimensional Hum, which really implements this really distorted and heavy and borderline fuzzed out guitar that really adds a lot of thick layers to it. Tobacco even uses this synth feedback. It's like every type of sound he could possibly conceive in itself is used as a layer or some kind of melody or maybe an arpeggio for each individual track, and that's pretty creative on his part. The track Memory Girl once again has more of this heavy ass guitar, but it also has these sampled bells that are pretty out there and pretty weird to throw into a cut of this nature. It's like he's able to take all these really abrasive and esoteric ideas and really make them catchy and accessible. It's pretty wild. But I think the most wild it gets is the track Let's Get Worn Away, the closing track, which is 6 minutes long, and it sounds like he took 4 to 5 different song ideas and turn them into this dissociative identity disorder monster. It's like one moment you have this like really pleasant synth bliss going on before it just all of a sudden goes into this analog odyssey monstrosity, before it then goes into one of his vocoder catchy passages, before it goes into something else, and it just like shifts just so unpredictably. I think my one reservation for this track, if I do have any, is like the wall of white noise that is kind of present there. It was cool as an element when the track itself was doing this thing, but after like 4 or 5 minutes, it just pretty much just drops into this droned out white noise thing that at first I hated, but after a few listens I was just like, okay, yeah, that's pretty peculiar, and I don't hate it as much anymore. I don't really have much of any tracks here that I dislike or think is less than great or less than good. The only track that I have a lot of reservations for is the track Suck Viper. The track itself maybe is a little too skeletal for its own good, and the synths sound incredibly airy. There's a lot of airiness to the instrumentals on this cut, but even that is kind of fascinating in its own right. The way these different types of tones just shift right in the middle of playing is really intriguing, even if this is my least favorite track on the record and it being brief as it is. So overall, I dug this thing quite a bit. It's not my favorite electronic album of the year. I think when Autechre put out their new album, every electronic album to me at this point is giving itself a run for its money. But still, this thing is intriguing. It's immediate, it's catchy, it's abrasive, psychedelic, it's fantastic. I just wish it was longer, and I just wish some of the tracks here were fleshed out a little better, maybe made more progressive or a little wonkier like some of the cuts on this album that I dig a lot. I think I'm definitely going to be looking forward to what Tobacco is going to drop next if he's going to continue making music that is this abrasive and yet incredibly accessible and psychedelic. This album is a plus 2.3 out of plus 3. Like I mentioned, if this was longer, this would, without a doubt in my mind, probably be my favorite electronic album of the year. Or maybe some of the tracks had more meat to them, but that's really it. I really didn't have a lot of complaints about this thing. But if you give me this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you like this album? Did you dislike this album? What was your reasoning for that, and what should I consider listening to and reviewing next? This is CWD Music Reviews here, signing off.